When you open Maya for the first time, it's going to look something very similar to this. Now, if it doesn't look similar to this, perhaps you've edited it, you've customized it a little bit, and you want to get it back to its original sort of default layout. For example, if I were to get rid of my outliner here, and I want to get it back to the original default layout, I can come up to the workspace drop-down menu and reset the current workspace, and then everything will snap back into position. I can then also lock my workspace so I can't accidentally move something or close a window that I need to have open. Now, the one thing that you will notice that's a bit different in my interface than your default workspace is that the colors are going to be a bit different for me because I've customized them, and we'll talk a bit about how to do that later. Now, the interface itself can be broken up into a few different areas. The first one being up here is your menu. This will not change depending on how you change your menu set. So this is where you're going to find things like copy and paste, delete, duplicate. Under edit, under file, you'll see that you have save scene, create, where you can create basic primitives, select, modify, display, windows, and the other menu items to the right of that is going to be called your menu set. This will change depending on which menu set you have selected. So currently we're in the modeling menu set. See if I go down to the rendering menu set. From Windows on, these menus will change. Below that, we have what's called the status line. This is where we can see if we have different types of snapping turned on, if our surface is live, if we have symmetry on. We have a few quick buttons for rendering here in our status line. And we can also save and open files from our status line. Below that, you have your shelves. Now, your shelves are customizable, and we can click through these and see all the different types of shelves that we have. So we have one specific for UV editing, rigging, animation, and so on. Personally, I like to make a custom shelf, and I have one here called Mega Shelf that has just about everything that I use on a regular basis in one shelf. Over here to the left, we have our outliner. This is where we're going to see all of our objects, our polygon models, our lights, and if we have any image planes in our scene, this is all going to appear in our outliner. Think of this as like the box that holds all of your nodes and objects. To the left of that, you have your toolbar, right? This is where we're going to find our move, scale, and rotate functions. We can also switch between different views here as well. So we have our perspective viewport, and I can also switch to my 4-panel view here where I have the top, front, side, and perspective view as well. That brings me to the viewport. The viewport is where you're going to be working. Think of this as the camera that's viewing your model. Your viewport has its own dedicated menu up here. So you have view, shading, lighting, show, renderer, and panel. So you can create new panels and tear off existing panels in this menu. Now think of this menu as editing the camera that you're looking through, right? So here we can change things like the wireframe view. We can turn lights on. We can even turn on motion blur and screen space ambient occlusion. We'll talk about this in more detail later. To the right of that, I'm going to call this your editors. So your 3 main editors that you're going to have here is your channel box. This is where you're going to see some important things like your history, your transforms, which we will also talk more about in the future, and some things that you can edit here as well. You also have your attribute editor. Think about this as a more detailed view of your channel box, whereas in your channel box, everything may show up in a list. In your attribute editor, things will show up as tabs. For example, if I just create a sphere, you see that now we have all of these tabs, and each one of these tabs is a node that gets created when you create an object. If I switch back to the channel box, we can see that we can see our transforms here. Also the creation node for our sphere, so we can edit things like the subdivisions and the size of our primitive object. And below that, you will see your history. Below that, we have display layers and animation layers. So we can, just like in Photoshop or Illustrator, we can put things in individual display layers and hide things and lock layers if we need to. You also have a modeling toolkit in your editor. This is very useful, and we will have a video or a section of the video talking about this on its own. Usually I keep the attribute editor open in most cases, and I'll only look at the channel box or the modeling toolkit if I need to use them. But for me personally, the attribute editor is the most useful editor to have open. At the very bottom here, we have our timeline. We have our play and reverse buttons here. Below our timeline, we have our time range slider. So here I can slide between ranges, and I can change the number of keyframes. Over here on the right of our range slider, we have our FPS, or frames per second, that we can quickly change here. We can turn on continuous loop. We can turn on cached playback. This is something I would recommend having off. I think it's turned on by default, but I would turn this off until you sort of have a better understanding of what exactly it does. But basically, it just saves an animation or saves a simulation to an external file. Here we have our volume, our auto keyframe toggle, and our animation settings. So if we click this guy, we'll see our animation settings pop up. At the very bottom here, we have our command line. This is where we can quickly type in some code or scripts if we are programmers, or if we know a little bit about scripting. And then to either side of that, you have what's called your helpline as well. To the left, you're going to see some useful tips. When you hover over things, you'll see this little tip icon change and sort of explain what every little thing does. And then on the very right, you have a helpline that will show you errors. If you do anything and this turns red, chances are it didn't do what you wanted it to do. So most likely there's an error. And I really encourage you to actually read the errors because Maya is pretty helpful in telling you exactly why something isn't doing what it should be doing. And if you want a more detailed view of this error, you can click this guy on the very bottom right corner, and this will bring up the script editor. But it will also tell you a very detailed explanation of whatever error that you have. And for the most part, that is all the individual segments of the Maya interface. If any of these windows happen to disappear or you close them by accident, you can find pretty much every menu in the application under the Windows menu. And here you'll see that we have the outliner, we have the node editor, the content browser, which can be very useful. And under general editors, we have our editors to the right, which is the attribute editor, channel box, and tool settings. Navigating Maya is pretty straightforward and what's known in the industry as industry standard navigation. So most 3D apps that you're going to be using these days are going to use a very similar navigation method, and that is holding your Alt or Option key on your keyboard and using your 3 mouse buttons. Now, I highly recommend getting a mouse because there's a lot of functions and techniques that are a bit difficult to do when you're just using a laptop touchpad. So I highly recommend getting a nice, comfortable mouse to be using with Maya, uh, rather than your touchpad on your laptop. Now, when it comes to navigating, we're going to hold down Alt or Option key and left mouse click and hold to rotate our camera around our scene. We're going to hold down Alt or Option middle mouse button to pan around the scene. And we can zoom in and out in 2 different ways. We can either use our mouse scroll wheel to zoom in and out, or we can hold down Alt or Option and the right mouse button to zoom our scene in and out. Now, you may by default have something up here in your top right corner called the View Cube. I believe this is found under Display, Heads-Up Display, View Cube. And you can navigate the scene using this View Cube by clicking and just rotating around. You can also go from your front, top, and side views as well. However, for me personally, I really recommend against using this. The reason being is that if you happen to switch to one of your other views, which you can do here in your toolbar, if you have, for example, a top view and then you rotate your camera with that view cube, you've kind of messed up your top view a little bit. So I would really discourage using your view cube. And for me personally, if you have that turned on, I would just go to Display, Heads-Up Display, and turn off your view cube and just learn how to navigate the interface with the Alt or Option key and your 3 mouse buttons. Now, another way you can quickly switch between views here is just tapping your spacebar. So if I want to quickly switch back to just my perspective view, I can just tap my spacebar and then I'm just in my perspective view. If I tap my spacebar again, I go back to my 4-panel view. And then if I want to look at my front view, again, just kind of move your mouse into the front view and tap your spacebar. And now you can see that I am in my front view. So a very easy, quick way to switch views just by tapping your spacebar. Now, if you hold your spacebar, you get this very useful menu that's actually every menu set in the app right here as a quick menu. So you'll see that this has mesh, your rigging menu set here, your animation menu set, your dynamics or effects menu set, and your rendering menu set. So this is very useful because in one little spacebar click, you can get every menu that's up here. You can learn to work really fast by using this menu. Now, when it comes to moving objects and creating objects, for example, let's create a sphere here. And let's zoom into it a little bit. I can move this object, rotate, and scale this object with my move, rotate, and scale tools here. However, I would recommend getting used to using the hotkeys for them, which is W, E, and R. So if I select my sphere here and hit W, I now have my move tool, so I can move this around. I can move it along a specific axis by clicking that specific axis. And I can move it along a plane of axes with these little guys here. These little arrows also correspond with the axis in your entire scene, which you can see down here in the bottom left of your viewport. You can see that we have an X, a Y, and a Z axis. If I hit my E key, I switch to my rotation tool. So I can click in here and free rotate. I can click Control Z to undo, or I can rotate along a specific axis. If I hit my R key, I will switch to my scale tool, where very similar to the move tool, I can scale it along a specific axis, or I can scale it on uniformly along all axes. Now, as you're moving things around, I want you to take a look in your channel box and look at your transforms. So start to get an understanding of how you're moving these objects around by looking at your transforms in your channel box. So you can see that as I scale an object, the scale will go up and down. And as I move the object around, the translates will move. And as I rotate, the rotates will move. Now, what's really useful about this is as I'm working on an object and say perhaps I'm scaling it out of proportion, and maybe I did that by accident, but I just really want to quickly get everything back to its original position. I can come over here to my transforms, and I'm going to zero out my translates and rotates just by clicking and dragging over those and typing in 0. And then for my scales, I'm going to put everything back to 1. And very quickly, I've just snapped my sphere that I created back to its default settings. Now, currently, I am in object mode for this sphere. The way I often switch between modes is by right-click and holding. And you can see that we have an edge mode where I can select individual edges and move them around. I can right-click and hold and get my vertex mode, select individual vertices and move them. And then I also have a face mode where I can select faces. And then I can go back to my object mode. Now, it's important to note that in many cases, you need to be in object mode to do a lot of functions. And a lot of functions will require you to be in a specific sort of mode, editing mode on your object to do different things. So for example, the target weld function only really works well if it's in vertex mode. And if you want to use the multi-cut function, which is one of our most used tools there, we're going to just do that in object mode and then click the multi-cut tool. And that will allow us to do things like add edge loops. We will talk about the multi-cut tool in more detail later. But for now, this is your basics and just how to navigate the workspace and navigate your scene and sort of just create objects and start moving objects around. Now, we've already covered some hotkeys like the navigation hotkeys and the spacebar, which will allow you to switch between views, and it will give you this really quick and handy quick menu with all of your menus in it. A few other really useful hotkeys is, well, the first one's going to be Control Z, which is undo. So if you go to File or Edit, you can see that you have Control Z to undo and Control Y to redo. Now, the Z key will also work as a undo key. So this allows you to just kind of back up in your process a little bit. So if I move an object around, I can click undo, and that will sort of back up in my process. And I use the undo key a lot I typically just use it as Control Z rather than just the Z key, just because that's what I'm used to hitting on other programs. Most other applications are their undo function is set to Control Z. So if I say by accident grab some faces here and hit my delete key and delete them, I can really easily just Control Z or Command Z if you're on a Mac to get those to undo that function. Now, another very useful hotkey is Control D, D for duplicate, or Command D, D for duplicate. And this will just allow you to duplicate an object. So if I hit Control D or Command D and I pull off a duplicate, so this is a very easy way to duplicate your objects. I highly recommend against using the copy and paste function for this, because when you copy and paste an object, you actually get a lot more that's copied. There's a lot more going on behind the curtains, so to speak, when you copy and paste something rather than just duplicating the object. So if you do want to duplicate an object, try to avoid copying, pasting until you have a real understanding of what that does. And just try to use Control D to duplicate your objects. Perhaps the most important hotkey ever is the save function. So that is Control or Command S. And again, if I go up to File, we can see that Save Scene is Control S because I'm on a Windows PC. If you're on a Mac, it's going to be Command S. And personally, I just kind of click Control S from time to time to save my scene. And it is a very useful and probably the most useful hotkey that you can do. The other hotkey that I use often is the G key. So for the G key will repeat your last action. So we're talking about G for golf or G for green. Right. So for example, if I delete some faces here and I want to bridge these back together, I can hold down Shift to select both of these, to select both of those faces, and click the bridge function. Now, if I want to repeat that action down here, like for example, on these two edges, I can then just hit the G key and that will repeat that last action. So the G key is one of the most useful tools most useful keys that I use, because you can really easily and quickly just repeat an action if you need to do something over and over again. This will work with any action, even deleting or scaling. If I want to, say, for example, merge two verts together, I can select those two vertices and go to Mesh or Edit Mesh, Merge to Center. Right. And then if I want to merge the next two, I can hit the G key. So the G key is a very useful hotkey to know. The next really useful hotkey we're going to talk about here is the F key, F for frame. Now, what the F key will do will center your camera and frame up the rotations of your camera based on what you have selection. So for example, if I select my entire sphere and hit the F key, it will frame it up and my camera will now rotate around the sphere. If I want to select an individual vertex and hit F, it will frame up that individual vertex, and now my camera is rotating around that vertex. This is very useful for long objects or large objects where it may be difficult to view one side. So for example, if I create a cube here and scale it out, so it's like a really long, say 2x4. And if I just want to look at one end of that, as I get close to that and start to move around my scene, you see that it's kind of jumping around quite a bit, and it's hard for me to kind of get a good angle on it because my camera is still sort of rotating around the center of my grid. So to fix that, I can just go into something like face mode and select that face and hit the F key. And now my camera is framed up on that specific face. So the F key, very useful to use. The other really useful hotkeys that I use a lot when I'm 3D modeling is the D key and the V key. So D as in dog, V as in vector or vertex. So holding down the D key, D as in dog, will allow me to change my pivot point. So if I hold down D, I can then move my pivot point around. So to explain what this does, if I rotate my object, it's rotating around the center of that object. But if I hold down D, switch to my move tool, hold down D and move my pivot point to one end of that object, my object is now going to rotate around that end. So holding down D to change your pivot point is something that I use quite a bit as I'm 3D modeling. You can also center your pivot point just by coming up to your poly modeling menu and clicking center pivot. You can also find that under modify center pivot. Now your D key will allow you to snap to points, your V key. So V as in vector, that is basically a snap to point. And if I hold down my V key, you see that it highlights this little magnet with a dot on it. And I can do the same thing just by toggling this on and off. But what this will allow me to do is snap my object to another object. So for example, if I create another cube here, and I move that to the side, and I just want to snap this long cube to this cube here, I can hold down V and snap it to that point. Now this is really useful if you hold down the D and the V key together, because then you can snap your pivot point. So say, for example, I want my pivot point snapped to this corner of this object. I can hold down D and hold down V and just left click and drag over what point I want that pivot point snapped to. And now my object will rotate around that point. We can also snap points together as we're modeling. So for example, if I switch to my vertex mode and say for some reason I want to snap this point to that point, I can hold down my V key and just kind of click and move over that axis, and that will snap those points together. So snapping is a very useful tool as well. You can also snap to your grid. Up here, you have a snap to grid option as well. If you click that, your object will now, or whatever you have selected, your selection will now snap to your grid. If I go to object mode, my entire object will now snap to those grid points. Now, we've already talked about how you can change your pivot point and move your pivot point around. But let's go into a little bit more detail about pivots and why you would want to freeze them or zero them out as opposed to keep them. So when you move an object around, for example, if I move this cube around, we can see that the transforms change. And I currently still have snap to grid on, so I'm going to turn that off. And you can see in the channel box, as I'm moving this around, my transforms will change. In some cases, I want to keep this as it is because, for example, let me just undo, use Control Z to undo, and say I have a door. In order for this door to animate correctly, I'm going to hold down my D key and my V key and snap my pivot point to the bottom corner. That way, when I rotate my door, it will rotate around the Y axis. And we can see that reflected here in our channel box. Now, in most cases, I want to keep those transforms because this allows me a very easy way to just select everything and return it to 0, right? And snap it back to its original form. In some cases, you want to zero out your transforms. For example, if you're about to do a function that's going to change an object, or you're going to add dynamics to it, or something like that. In many cases, you want to zero out your transforms. And you can do that by clicking this little snowflake button here, which will zero out your transforms, or you can go to Modify Freeze Transformations. Now, when I do that, you'll see that everything in my outliner or my channel box will go to 0 and my scales will go to 1. So it zeroed out those transforms. Now, say, for example, I'm moving this object around and I have in my mind that at some point I may want to move that back to the origin it was to begin with. So I can very easily zero those out, and that just snaps back to the origin. Now, you want to be careful about zeroing out your transforms with the Freeze Transformations button, because sometimes if I move my object, and now with this object move, if I freeze my transformations or zero out my transforms, it's going to be really hard for me to move this back to its original position without knowing the rotate transforms that I moved it to originally. So be very careful about freezing your transforms if you think that perhaps you want to return that object to its original position at some point, because if you have a rotated object like so and you freeze the transforms, without using some other functions, it's going to be almost impossible to return your object to its original position. Now, of course, you can Control or Command Z to undo, but that only works if you haven't closed Maya. Once you close Maya, your undo history goes away, and that won't work anymore. So just be mindful about your pivots and your transforms. Now, the other thing I want to talk about here is your history. Now, at the moment, I don't have a lot of history, and this line here will be your history. But as I do functions, for example, if I go to vertex mode and I begin moving verts around, we can see that not a lot is being added to my history. But if, for example, I go to my multi-cut tool, which we'll talk about shortly, as I'm adding edges, you can see that these poly split inputs get added to my history. Now, as you're working, as you're 3D modeling something, you may want to delete your history from time to time, because if you get a lot here, it will start to slow your scene down and make things kind of lag a little bit. It is very useful that Maya basically saves every action that you do, because you can very easily go back. And for the most part, this is kind of like your undo history, right? So as I click Control Z, it's going to move those, it's going to remove those poly splits that I did. But from time to time, as you're 3D modeling, you may want to delete your history. So you can do that just by clicking this button right here with the little clock on it, or go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, and that will clear out your history. Now, in some cases, you may not want to clear your history. In cases of, again, if you're doing something dynamic, you may not always want to delete your history because that will delete the dynamics from it. If you're performing a Boolean operation, that will also remove the Boolean operation and sort of commit your shapes. And I know that may not make a lot of sense now, but it will if you keep watching the videos and learn about Booleans at some point. So again, just like knowing to freeze your transforms and when not to freeze your transforms, it's also very important to know when to delete your history and when to keep your history as well. The next thing I'd like to talk about is some useful tools that we will be using quite a bit in Maya and the modeling toolkit itself. You can access the modeling toolkit by coming over here to your editors and clicking the modeling toolkit. It's also this little sort of like a Rubik's Cube with a hammer icon there as well. Now here you're going to find a lot of your most commonly used tools when 3D modeling, like extrude, smart extrude, bevel, bridge, multicut, and so on. So let's talk about these tools individually. Probably one of the most common tools that we use are the extrude, or most common functions that we use is the extrude function. You can use the extrude function in a couple different ways. The first way to use the extrude function is to select an edge or a face that you want to extrude. And just by holding down Shift and clicking and dragging to move that out, that will extrude out your object. Now you can do this with a face or an edge and get a result like that. Now the other way you can use your extrude function is to actually use the function itself. So if I click a face and I come up here to the extrude function here or in my modeling toolkit and click extrude, my widget will change to be slightly different, and then I'll get this little menu that pops up here that will allow me to change things. So I can move it around here with the widget. I can also left click and drag and change things like my thickness, my translate Z, or my offset. I can even change the number of divisions on my object. So typically I keep that down to 1, but you can change that if you like. Now this function here, keep faces together, is something that I want you to use. I want you to know about, and I want you to use with caution. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to create a new cube here. And I'm going to go to my channel box and just add some divisions. And I'm doing this just by clicking and dragging over those divisions. And then I'm middle mouse clicking and dragging in my scene. And I can really quickly add divisions to an object that way. Now, say for example, I want to extrude some of my faces here. So I'm going to select a grouping of faces and use my extrude function and extrude them out like so. Now, if we look inside the object, right, we can see that there's no interior faces here. It extruded those out as if they are together, right? Now, if I change this function to keep faces together from on to off, you can see that now I have all this interior geometry because it extruded out my objects separately, right? So now if I grab one of these faces and move it, we can see that those are separated out. Whereas if I undo back to before I turn that setting on and I select an individual face they are together. Now, this can be very useful. Say, for example, if I want to make like a T shape out of a cube or an X shape, if I just grab my 4 surrounding faces here and click my extrude function and extrude them out, it will kind of extrude them out as a cube like that. And in some cases, that may be what I want. But if I switch my option here to keep faces together to off, it will extrude them out individually like a T shape. So I highly recommend getting used to using the extrude function. It can be very useful. The one thing you do want to kind of keep an eye out, the one error that you'll often get with the extrude function is what I call a double extrusion. So this happens when you may select a face and hit the extrude function and then not actually move that face. So if I click off of that now, it doesn't look like that actually extruded. But then if I grab that face and move it, we'll see that it is. So oftentimes what a lot of new users in Maya will do is accidentally create these double extrusions. So they'll select a face, hit extrude, click off of it, and perhaps get distracted by something going on in their life, right? And then they realize that they didn't extrude it, so they'll select that face again, click extrude again, and then what they've done here is extruded that face twice. So this will start to pile up vertices on top of each other that you don't necessarily want. See? So now I have these vertices that are all kind of piled up on top of each other. So be mindful about using the extrude tool and try not to get double extrusions if you can. Now, new to Maya 2025 is Smart Extrude. Smart Extrude has an extra little layer to extrude. And what this will do is instead of, I guess we can call it a dumb extrude, where, for example, if I select this face and just extrude downward like that, we get this double face, right? And we get what's called Z-fighting, this flickering. This is basically 2 faces that are so close together, your viewport doesn't know which one to display properly. So that's obviously not what we want, right? That's a dumb extrude. So let's undo that, and instead we'll use our Smart Extrude, and we get that nice little icon there showing that it's on, and we can see that that drags down, and that automatically sort of edits our geometry and deletes that for us. Now we can also do something like punch holes in our geometry. So for example, if I grab these faces and I just do a simple or dumb extrude all the way through, we get these black faces, and obviously it's not really extruded the way that we want it to be. So instead, I can do a Smart Extrude, and if I extrude all the way through, it will just automatically punch a hole through our geometry for us. So that Smart Extrude function is very useful. Now, the next tool I want to talk about here is the multi-cut tool. I would say this is probably the second most used tool or function that you will use within Maya. And you can use the multi-cut tool a few different ways. The easiest way to use it is to left click on an edge and drag around, and you get this little point, and then you can left click and drag on another edge and so on, and continue to make new edges on your object. Now that creates something called an n-gon, which we'll talk about later. And an n-gon is basically any polygon face that has more than 4 sides to it. For example, this particular face has 5 sides to it, or 5 edges surrounding it. Now, if I want to fix that n-gon, I could really easily hold down Control or Command, and I'll get what's called an edge loop. This will create a loop all the way around my object until it reaches an n-gon, or non-manifold geometry. So I can really easily fix that end-on, or those two end-ons, by holding down Control to create an edge loop, and then left-clicking and dragging along that edge and snapping it together. I can then use my G key to repeat that action, or I can hit my Enter key to just commit that action as well. So you can either hold down Control to get an entire edge loop, or you can just click and drag to create edges. The other way to use your multi-cut tool is to slice. So it will allow you to slice. So if I have the multi-tool active and I left click and drag like that, I will get a slice all the way through my geometry. Now, I use this often to get sort of a straight line sliced throughout my geometry, because sometimes, for example, if I take these edges here and move them in, and then I'll use my multi-cut tool. See how the edge is bending and it's not straight because it's trying to conform to that shape a little bit. Sometimes I want to slice just going straight down. So what I can do is hit my space bar to switch to a front view. And then I can hold down Shift, hover over the outside here, left click and drag down to slice through my object. So the multi-cut tool is very useful. It does have other options. We can turn on step snaps here. There's also a smoothing angle function that will try to change the angle of the new edge that you create. I'd recommend leaving that off for now until you have a better understanding of what that option does. You can snap to percentages across your edge or span by holding down Shift. So for example, if I hold down Shift, I can then snap to every 10%. So if I want a new edge loop right in the middle of that edge loop, I can just hold down Shift and Command or Control and get a perfect edge loop right down the middle. The next tool that I use quite often is the target weld tool. And I actually want to talk about the target weld tool and the bridge tool together, because I would say they're probably, in my rankings of tools that I use a lot, they're probably up there pretty high, probably at the same spot, right? So what the target weld tool will allow you to do, if I go into vertex mode, is just weld one vertex to another. So I can go through, and this new edge loop that I created, I can just go through and weld those together. Now, this is very useful for closing up seams. So for example, if I go through and weld all these together, say, for example, I have a seam in my geometry. So I'm going to go to my multi-cut tool and add a new edge loop right here. And I'm going to select the interior faces here by using Shift double click. So if I double click an edge loop, I get that entire edge loop selected. You can do the same thing with faces by going to face mode, click one face, hold down Shift and double click a face next to it, and you'll get that entire face ring. So say, for example, I have two objects and there's a seam in between them like this, and I want to stitch up that seam. One way to do this is to use the target weld tool. So I can very easily come back in here and weld up those seams. Whoops. Like so. Another way I could do this is to use the bridge tool. So for example, if I want to bridge these together instead, I can right click and go to edge mode, select my two edges, and I can use my bridge tool. This will give me some options here, but I can just use my G key, again, holding down Shift and selecting both of those, and using my G key to bridge those together. You can add divisions and taper and twist and things like that to your bridge tool if you want to, but you don't have to. Bridge tool, very, very useful. And the next tool I want to talk about here briefly is the bevel tool or the bevel function. I like to use bevel a lot on objects, and I'll show you exactly what bevel does. Let's just delete this guy, and we'll create a new cube here. And I use bevel for a few different things, but the main thing I use bevel for is just to round out an edge or round out a surface. So say, for example, if I select these four edges here and use my bevel tool, I can then sort of change the fraction of that, and I can change the segments of that to get a round surface. Now, this will only bevel the edges that you have selected. So, for example, if I just want to bevel one edge like that, I'll just select that edge and use my bevel function, and I can just round out that edge by itself. If I want to bevel all of my edges, I can select them all, click bevel, and I can bevel them individually. Now, I do want you to be a bit careful with beveling all of your edges, because a lot of times if you have divisions, so let's go and add some divisions to our cube here. And now if I select all of my edges and bevel them, it will also bevel the individual edges all the way through. So not just my corner, it's beveling my individual edges as well. So that brings me to the other way that I like to use bevel, and that is to split up an edge. If I have one edge loop like this, I can really easily split it into two edge loops by using the bevel function, or three edge loops, or four or five. So I also like to use the bevel function to sort of multiply an edge loop if I want more detail there. So then I can say, select this edge loop and move that in a little bit and get a completely different shape. So there are a lot of other functions and tools that I use on a regular basis, but those are the sort of the superstars of my 3D modeling methods. I use those specific tools a lot. The next thing I want to talk about here is customization. So as we've already mentioned, I do have this sort of custom shelf that I made, and I enjoy using this because it has sort of every tool that I use on a regular basis. And I don't have to switch between menus to find the tools that I want. Now, if you want to make your own custom shelf like this, what you can do is click on this little cog and you can say new shelf, and you can give that a name. So I can name this something like custom shelf and hit OK. It's telling me that that is not unique because there's already something named custom here, right? So we'll actually use that shelf instead because it's empty. Now, anything that I find myself using on a regular basis, for example, if I go to Mesh Tools and I want to bring my multi-cut tool in here, I can hold down Control and Shift. And then I have my multi-cut tool. Now I can also hold down Control and Shift and click the menu set or the settings for that multi-cut tool. And then I'll have two icon bars here that one will bring up my settings for my multi-cut tool, and one will just activate my multi-cut tool like that. A really easy way you can add your commonly used things to your shelf, your custom shelf. If you want to delete things here, you can right click and delete them. You can also organize them. So you can go to your shelf editor and you have some extra settings here where you can do things like pick a custom icon for a specific tool, or you can rearrange your shelves and so on. Now, another way you can customize Maya is by customizing your colors, as I have done. If you go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, you have color settings here. And this is a bit complicated to look through, but you can basically click on a lot of things like inactive or active. I may make a video going over this in more detail in the future, but feel free to experiment. And the way that I like to kind of experiment is I'll go through and look at things like objects and try to match up the colors, right? So I don't see any objects there. Polygon surfaces here are showing as black. So what that means is if I select an object or turn on my wireframe on shaded view here for that object, that wireframe is showing up as black. And I can change that here as well. I like keeping it as black, so you can customize your colors that way. You can switch between colors on your view by holding down the Alt or Option button and hitting the B key. So Alt B for background will cycle through different colors in your background. I have this sort of custom dark purple color in my gradient background that I like to use. And you can change that just by going to General 3D Views and change the color there. Feel free to experiment with this and try to find colors that maybe work for you on your personal computer. And if you don't like the colors, if you've sort of gone through and you've changed a lot of stuff, you can always go to Edit, Reset to Defaults, and that will change everything back to the default settings. And I want to give you some final tips for starting your 3D modeling journey with Maya. Some useful things to know here within the Maya settings. And probably one of the most problematic hotkeys that people will use from time to time is the B key. The B key will turn something on called soft selection. So what this does, for example, if I select a vertice and move that vertice around, it just moves that one vertice around. If I then click the B key, it will then toggle soft selection on. So I get this sort of gradient appearing on my screen. And now if I move the single vertice, it will move a bunch of vertices together. So this can be useful in some situations, but I find what a lot of new users do is they'll hit the B key by accident, and then they get into this menu and they don't know how to get out of it, and they can't edit their object the way that they want to edit their object. So just be mindful of the B key, B as in background, and that will turn our toggle on or off soft selection. So to turn it off, we can just hit B again, and that will toggle soft selection on and off. You can change the size of your soft selection if you do want to use it by holding down B and middle mouse clicking, and that will change the size of your soft selection. So just be mindful of that. It is a key that has been the frustration of many people in the past because they've accidentally hit it and they don't know how to turn it off. Another quick tip here is to change your camera settings. So your default camera settings are a little bit weird. I would recommend changing your. I would recommend making these changes to your default camera. So to get to your default camera settings, you can go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and then looking at your preferences. And we can click on Cameras, and we have a few settings that we want to change, mainly your near clip plane and far clip plane. I think by default, your near clip plane is a value of 0.1. And I'm going to show you what that does. So I'm going to set these. Actually, I'm going to leave these as they are, and I'll change them in my actual camera. But you may want to come in and actually change these and set these to be a 1 and something like 1 million instead of their default, which is like 0.1 and 1,000, I think. And I'll show you what that does in the camera. I'd also just recommend poking around the settings a little bit and looking at other things. You can change your working units from things like centimeters to inches or feet. However, I highly recommend that you just get used to working with centimeters. The reason for that being is that most 3D applications use centimeters, and rather than constantly switching back and forth, it's best to just kind of learn to work with centimeters. I highly recommend just sort of poking around in here and looking at some of your other settings. You can always go up to Edit and Restore Default Settings. Now, looking at your camera, a really quick way we can select our camera and get our camera settings is to come up to our viewport menu and just select our camera, click our camera there. And then if we go to the attribute editor, we have all of our camera settings. Now, the first thing I like to change in my camera is the focal length. This very much matches the settings of like a digital camera or a changeable lens camera, like a mirrorless camera or DSLR. A lot of these settings are very similar to those settings. So depending on what you want, you can change your focal length to have wildly different looks to your scene. So while I'm modeling, I like to have mine set to around 43, which is a lot more similar to what the human eye sees in terms of perspective distortion. So that's typically what I like to keep mine at. But say you model the scene and you want to render it and you want to give it like a fisheye look, you can lower your focal length to something like 18. And then as you can see, you get much more perspective distortion now. And you have the sense that this object is much bigger. So you can have a lot of fun messing around with your camera settings. As I'm modeling, I like to keep this between 40 and 50, again, because that's a little bit more what the human eye sees. Now, your near clip plane and far clip plane, let me reset these to the default settings, which I think is 0.1 and 1,000. And what these settings do, let me go back to my camera here, is your near clip plane is as you get closer to your object, your camera will clip out at 0.1 centimeter. Remember, we're set to centimeter. So I have to get really close to my object for it to start to clip out like so. And then your far clip plane is as you go farther away, your object will eventually start to clip out. Let me make our cube here a lot bigger so we can see this in action. So as I begin to rotate away, our object clips out of our scene. Personally, I don't like this, and I like to set my far clip plane much higher to something like 1 million. And then for the near clip plane, sometimes we get like a weird flickering that will start to happen with our scene. You can kind of see that in action there. If I make this bigger again, and as I go far away, you'll see that our object starts to flicker a little bit. So when you're working with really big scenes, this weird thing will happen. And this is actually your near clip plane. So I'm going to change my near clip plane to a value of 1. Another quick tip I'd like to give you is saving. Whenever you're saving your scene, you do have an option for autosave and you have an option for incremental save. So if we go up to File, Save Scene, and look at the settings for Save Scene, we can turn on incremental save. And what this will do is save versions of the project that we're working on. So every time we hit Control S to save, it will save a new file, a new version of the project that we're working on. So I can set this to my heart's content. It will give it a unique name. And this way I can, if I mess up, I can always go back to a previous version of my file. I can change the number of saves. I would recommend keeping this around 20. You don't want to end up with hundreds of files as you're working on your object. The other nice save option that you have is under Windows again, and Settings Preferences, and going to the under Settings, Files and Projects. So if I go under Files and Projects, I have this autosave function. And if I enable that, I can then change the interval for time for how often it will just automatically save my scene for me. I can also have it prompt me before it saves, or I can just have it save it without asking me. I can also limit to the number of autosaves. Now, this is a cool feature, but if you turn this on, I highly recommend that you also turn on incremental save, which we just talked about. The reason being is that if you have this turned on, you can very easily save over something. You can have a mistake in your project and you can save over a previous version, and then you lose, you can't go back. So say you accidentally delete something and then this auto saves, you can then never get that thing you accidentally deleted back. So be very careful about turning on autosave. I keep this setting turned off because I'm pretty good at saving as I'm working. But if you do want to keep that turned on, I highly recommend turning that on and going to File, Save Scene, Settings, and also turning on incremental save. So that way, rather than saving over a previous version, it will just save a new version instead. And that is a quick rundown of what I think is some of the most important things to know when you get started into 3D modeling or just as a new Maya user. If you have questions, please let me know. I'm happy to make new videos explaining specific things. And I hope you enjoy using Maya now that you know a little bit better how it works.